Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Ruby Macdougall, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Michigan, to talk about her research on the ethnic dances of the Yi minority in China's Yunnan province. Ruby, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So you're studying something unique that we haven't tackled in this podcast before, which is dance and particularly ethnic dance in China. Can you give us an overview of what it is that you're looking into with your research?
Sure. To do this, my research has like a million overlapping layers, which I think probably everybody's research does. But to talk about my sort of current project, I'm going to go back a little bit to talk about the way I came to this project. So I have a background as a dancer myself, and my sort of inroad into learning about China came through dance. I ended up, after studying Chinese in Beijing for a year, I studied Mandarin. I ended up going to Yunnan province because, I think as you know, Yunnan province is a very diverse province, and a lot of people who I were talking to in Beijing, they kept sort of telling me that since you're a dancer, you should go to Yunnan. And I didn't really understand the connection, just, coming from America and not really understanding how like one place would be specific to having a lot of dancers or something. But that's what I kept hearing, that I should go to Yunnan. So I went to Yunnan province and discovered that indeed there were a lot of dancers around, just sort of like doing like Xiaoxu Minzu dance in the park, or a lot of like dance performances or, ethnic minority performances. And at that time, I didn't really understand that they were being performed in this sort of context of tourism. I was just really enthralled by the amount of different kinds of dance that I was seeing. So fast forward a little bit, and I sort of did some independent research in the region, talking to dancers, meeting with dancers, dancing with them, largely like in the park. And I just became really curious about how these dancers that I saw practicing in the park, like what the history of their dance practices were. So I, ended up doing my master's at the University of Hawaii, and I did a research project in Yunnan that actually turned out to be an ethnography of a hip hop dance group in Yunnan. And part of how that came about was that I was looking at and researching different dance studios in Kunming, which is the capital city of Yunnan. And, they had these open classes for anybody. And so I started taking classes with them and sort of became friends with them, and, asked if I could conduct this research study at their studio. They agreed to it. And through my interviewing them, I learned that they were really pushing back against a lot of the kind of stereotypes about Yunnan through their hip hop dance. And part of it was that they are this private studio, and they don't receive any funding from the government. And they were, they were disappointed and annoyed that they didn't receive funding for their studio, because all of the funding went to fund these like cultural dance studios or performances.
And when you talk about pushing back against stereotypes, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, so Yunnan as a place, and you probably understand a lot of how characteristics sort of emerge out of geography and whether or not they are branded or stereotyped or not. So Yunnan as a province has really, through intentional administrative practices, become, and did this intentionally, branded as like this almost anti-modern province, or it's a colorful province, you know, full of diversity and full of these sort of ancient cultural practices that you can come and see as a tourist. So that's sort of like a broad generalization of the way that Yunnan has sort of developed these stereotypes. So how dance fits into this is hip hop doesn't really match with that brand. And so the funding for artists in the region usually has to, you know, there are parameters to the funding so that they are more or less required to produce cultural work that fits the brand of Yunnan. And, you know, hip hop doesn't. And so this studio, in that way, they were annoyed because they felt like they were being sort of pigeonholed to perform what is sort of known as culturally theirs, but they didn't feel affinity towards it and they didn't want to be performing it. They wanted to be dancing hip hop. So I ended up doing my master's thesis writing about this dance company and how they fit into the kind of like ecosystem of dance productions in Yunnan. And that was where I really started getting interested in the idea of, I guess, querying ethnic dance and how ethnicity is like represented or embodied in different forms of dance and what the meaning can be from that. Specifically in China, because that's my field, but I but I now in my dissertation, I also sort of think about that a little bit in terms of dance practices in the United States.
So in the materials that you sent me, you talk about something called dance performances. Can you give a little more context to what it is that you're talking about and the influences that comprise this dance performance?
Sure, yeah. So, right, so I just told you my thesis. Basically, my research now, it started from this idea of like, what does ethnicity mean in dance? And I worked backwards. And so this performance happened in 1946 in Kunming. And to my knowledge, it's the first performance, sort of staged performance that's called an ethnic dance performance that happened in Kunming. So there was, you know, other performances, but there was not a staged performance of ethnic dance until this one, to my knowledge, or that I have found. So this dance performance happened at the end of the Sino-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War had just finished, and then the Chinese Civil War was really starting to heat up again. And so Kunming was like this bastion of democratic efforts, basically. And as you know, there were so many intellectuals and artists and students who had to leave the coastal regions of China and move to Kunming during the Sino-Japanese War. So Kunming had this very rich intellectual environment during these years and after, but and before. But there was this unique sort of generator. And so during the months where the Civil War was really heating up between the Nationalists and the Communists, and then these players kind of in the middle that were more associated and connected to the Democratic League, a crew of intellectuals who were based out of Yunnan University and occasionally worked in Yunnan County, which is outside of Kunming, where the stone forest is now. It's a big tourist site. They did a little bit of like service work, is what they called it, where they would go and meet with Yi people and maybe like read, do literacy campaigns, etc. So they had developed a relationship with Sani Yi people in Yunnan region, and they had an idea to bring singers and dancers from the region into Kunming and put on this performance as a way to kind of like unify the people in the city, because everything was getting just so tense, and everybody was just like, there was just like a lot of fractures everywhere. So they were going to bring this group in, and it was going to be this joyful, exuberant reminder of ancient Chinese culture and how it could sort of like bring everybody together. That basically happened. The performance happened, despite efforts by the Nationalists to censor the performance, because they were worried that, I should say too, that the Democratic League intellectuals who I'm referring to were at this point much more aligned with the Communists and against Nationalists. So this performance was sort of like antagonistic to the Nationalists, because it was going to unite everybody against the Nationalists. So there was attempts to censor the performance. It didn't work. The performance went on. There was like thousands of people who were able to see the performance. At the end of the performance, there was like 3,000 people on a athletic field dancing around a fire all together. And these are like according to newspaper articles written about the performance. And so it was a giant success. The thing that I became really interested in with this performance after learning about it, and I learned about it because my advisor actually, Emily Wilcox, is so generous with sharing materials. She knew that I, was interested in just understanding the history of dance in Kunming, and she had this at some point, and she, sent it to me and thought it would be interesting, and it just really like sparked this whole deep dive into the performance. And so what really interested me, just beyond the fact that here was this like documentation of ethnic dance performance in 1946, was the way that the intellectuals who were involved in orchestrating it I was really interested in how they wrote about the performance and how they understood and sort of configured ethnicity in that performance as something that would revitalize Chinese society, basically, and that it would actually be like ethnic dance that would revitalize Chinese society. And reading, what they wrote about this performance, I was just really struck with how similar their writing was to the way a lot of people were writing about modern dance in America and Europe. So I just like continued to dig deep into that and realized that there are significant overlaps and significant engagements with sort of intellectual ideas coming out of like the modernist movement from Europe and America, and specifically Winnie Daw, one of the people who was involved with orchestrating this performance, who was a poet and a really influential organizer, I guess, in Kunming during these years. He wrote an essay that's called Speaking of Dance. And in this essay, he engages extensively with Ernst Gruss, an art historian and ethnographer from Germany, who wrote a book in 1893 called The Beginnings of Art. And in that, there's a chapter called The Dance. And the two, Winnie Daw's essay, Speaking of Dance, and this chapter, The Dance, are nearly identical, basically. And so I just really became interested in why and how we could read Winnie Daw's writing, how it applies to this performance, and how it differs from Ernst Gruss's writing about Aborigine or Aboriginal dances, because that's what he was writing about.
I want to pull a quote from one of the materials you sent me. So you write, the League wrote articles about the effect of, quote, primitive, and you use the word 原始 in Chinese to translate primitive, power and transformative possibilities that the performance held for the people and the future of China. Can you elaborate a little more on this quote and what it is that you're trying to demonstrate through it?
Yes, that's a great question. So, and it gets into these theories about what dance can do to society that were floating around in sort of like dance modernist discourse, that you know, from New York to Paris to Tokyo to Shanghai, sort of they were floating around, I would say circulating. And I was just really surprised to find them in Kunming in this period. And this idea sort of starts again with Ernst Gruss and how he writes about dance. And in it, he says that physical movements are kind of like infectious, especially if they are coming from the primitive tribes, or actually he says only if they're coming from the primitive tribes. And so this is pretty common, this like divide between like primitive and civilized, right? And so the way that European intellectual writing about like the primitive tribes configured these in opposition to their civilized people. And then there was a lot of kind of romanticization of that within the modern art world. And you see that especially reflected in modern dance with people like Mary Wigman and Isadora Duncan, who really like mined antiquity for material because they saw that as an antithesis to the sort of like soils of industrial civilization, basically. So, so there's this idea that the primitive tribe dances are contagious. And as a spectator, if you're watching one of these, you will feel inside of you the same things that the dancers are feeling. And that will like bring you into them and them into you, and there will be some sort of like unified spirit of the group. A lot of modern dancers and dance critics in New York, one especially John Martin, developed this idea into a very robust theory called metakinesis, which is still floating around today, now called kinesthetic empathy, which is just the idea that if you're watching somebody dance, you have the feeling of the movements that are happening. You can feel them in your interior. And there is a little bit of scholarship pointing to Ernst Gruss as the kind of like originator of this idea of metakinesis and then kinesthetic empathy. But what I was really interested in with this performance was how this idea, because I was really familiar just as a dancer with the idea of kinesthetic empathy and what it was, and being trained in modern dance, like I sort of took it for granted. And I was so surprised to find it show up in this performance and the way that people were writing about this performance. But it's transposed into a completely different context, And so the European and American sort of modernist artistic context that this is floating around in really situates like these polar opposites of, civilized and primitive, and the self and the other. And what I see happening in these articles about this one dance performance that the Democratic League writers were writing is that they're using the concept that dance can unite a group together through this like process of metakinesis. Like they're using that idea, but they're not really positioning themselves as Han intellectuals in polar opposite to the Sani Yi performers. They're sort of like using Chineseness as an umbrella, and they're saying that this Sani dance performance is going to bring everybody together. But they're not saying that they are like the other as much as they are the bearers of our culture, and we have forgotten it. And this was pretty common, like in these years, was a bit of a romanticization and even like infantilization of minority groups, sort of like not forgetting the past.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to know, if someone's listening to this episode and they're interested in knowing more about dance in China or the history of dance in China, what would be one or two books that you would recommend someone read?
So I would recommend my advisor's book, definitely, Revolutionary Bodies, Dance in Socialist China. I think that's the full name. And also there's an article written by Nan Ma. It's called Transmediating Kinesthesia, Wu Xiaobang and Modern Dance in China, 1929 to 1939. And I believe there's a book coming or is out also by her.
Great, Ruby. Thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.